All right, so in this module, most of this has been about setting up rows and columns, right? That's kind of the major aspect we've talked about. But if we go back to what I talked about here, remember, it's not just about setting up how many columns you have and how many rows. Sometimes it's about laying out the content in your table cell and setting that either horizontally, like say on the right side or the center or the left side. And then we could also do this in terms of vertical, which is, setting this to the top of a box, to the middle of a box, or to the bottom of the box. Okay. And so this is the second part, the second major aspect of CSS grids. I'm not going to get too deep into this because, to be honest, this comes up a lot more with the next type of layout, which is called Flexbox. But I'm going to talk about it a little bit because you might want to use it. And so let's talk about grid alignment and distribution. Okay. So what you have to understand is that when you set something up as a display grid or as a display flex, which we haven't talked about yet, but we'll get to this, they work the same way, is that your item, the container has two axes, something called the main axis and the cross axis, okay? The main axis is we can align or distribute the stuff inside of a grid along the main axis. And we can also display it along the cross axis. By default, CSS grids, the main axis goes horizontally and the cross axis goes vertically. You can technically change this, but that's the default. Okay. So what we can do is when we set up a grid, we can align the content to. So justify content goes along the main axis. And what it says is you can take all the content of your grid and align it to the start, which is the far left, the center, or the end, which is the far right. Okay. So I'm going to go to exercise 13. I have a container here with about 9 elements in it. And you can see that I've kind of set up my grid here to be 3 columns, each about 100. Let's set up some row gap or column gap just for fun. All right, let's preview this. So what's going on here is I have this is the container itself, the div. These are the grid items. Now, the reason why they're not going the full width is, well, we set the column, due to the way we've set up the layout, each column is 100 pixels wide. Okay. What did we see? It's, see that we set that there. If I hadn't set the width of that, then maybe it would have, if we'd set that to a fraction or a percentage, then it could take up the whole width. But right now, they're locked into this. Okay. What that means is that, see how there's like all this empty space that's still available? What I could do is say, this is my main axis. What I could do is say, I want all of this content, which is the whole items. I want it at the start. I want it at the end, or I want it in the center. Okay. When we talk about the main axis distributes content or aligns content using something called justify content. So I'm going to go into here and I'm going to say justify content. It's already starting off at start, which is the left side. So let's do end. Okay. And see how it places all of the content on this side now? So I've changed the alignment from the left side to the right side, or from the start to the end. I could also put it in the center. Center places it horizontally in the center, okay? Note that justified content only works if your container is either a grid or something we haven't talked about yet called a flex box. If it's just a regular container like div or something, you know, this is not going to work, okay? This only works in the case that you've changed the way that the content lays out to either a grid or a flex box, okay? If I wanted to make sure it's always at the left side, that would be start, okay? We can also do distribution. Distribution is when you lay stuff out. So for instance, you know, let's say, I'm just going to go back to Figma for a second. Let's say I had something like this. And let's just say I wanted to distribute all of these evenly. I could do something like this, distribute, and see how it kind of spaces everything out. We can do kind of the same thing with a CSS grid. The way that we would do that is using something called space between, space around, or space evenly. You'll only really notice this if you have more than basically three or more columns of stuff. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to understand. But I have here 1 column, 2 column, 3 column. What I'm going to do is say, rather than start, center, or end, I want to distribute each column so it kind of stretches out over this whole, you know, container here. So if I were to say space around, actually space between. See how it like takes the first column and it's aligned all the way to the left. The last column is all the way to the right, and this one's in the center. So what it does is it distributes them evenly, kind of like what I just did there. If I were to actually add another column, it would once again kind of distribute it evenly. Oops, sorry. Change the number of columns here. See how they're still evenly distributed? So there's space between, there's space around. Space around is kind of the same idea. It distributes it. The difference is that it doesn't align it directly to the left or to the right here. Kind of, you'll notice that this space is even, and then this is actually, the space here and here is half of this. So essentially it figures out the space, puts 2 parts of the space equal here, and then takes the last third and divides it into 2 parts, puts 1 at the end and 1 at the beginning. I know I just made that sound really more complicated, so hopefully you can kind of visualize what I just did. And then the last thing is there's space, space around, space between, and then space evenly, which is a newer one that just came out a couple of years ago. And what that does is these should all be equal now. So it's like this space is not half, but these are all equal to each other. But you're still not having the elements aligned to the left or the right. That is justify content, okay? That's the main axis, as I talked about. And at least with CSS grids, the default is to go left to right, okay? There are ways of changing that. I don't want to get too deep. That's kind of more advanced grid stuff, but just know that most of the time when we do this, it should be doing it along left to right. There's the other axis, which is the cross axis. In this case, when we talk about the cross axis with grids, that usually means vertically and it means going top down. So we have another property called align content. So we had justify content, align content, okay? So what this is going to be doing is setting up our content to be at the top of our, so it's going to be doing vertically. It's going to be displayed either at the top, the center, or the bottom. So I have kind of a grid here, 3 columns, each is 100. And I have a lot of available space. I specifically set up this height here. So there's kind of this extra space here. And what I'm going to do is say align content. And just like we had sort of justify content, start, and center, we can do that same thing here. If I say end, what that means is that it's going to take all of the content and align it to the bottom of this container, and it puts it at the bottom. I could put it all in the center, which places it all in the center of this. Now you can tell this is the vertical center because if we actually go and change this, I'm going to change this from 400 to 700. See how it's still in the vertical center here? Okay. And I could put it at the top, which would be align content start. Okay. Just like how we did the distribution. So we distributed like horizontally here, right? But you can actually also distribute vertically. So let's imagine I had something like kind of like this, and I'm going to zoom in here. Highlight, and I'm going to distribute this vertically. And so they're all now becoming equal, right? And that's kind of the same thing, just doing it vertically as opposed to horizontally what we did. So remember, we had space between. Space between, we'll put the first item at the very top and then the last item at the very bottom and then distribute the rest evenly. In this case, that would do that, okay? That's because I only have 3 rows. If I had more rows, then that would affect this. So if I add, I'm going to add another row here. And you can see it's still distributing it evenly. We could do space around, which is still going to distribute it, but it's going to put half the space at the top and the bottom. And then we could distribute evenly along the horizontal. This is putting equal amount of space at the beginning and in between each row here. Now, you know, you might look at this and be like, where does this really come up? Okay. And it will come up more and more as we get more sophisticated. I just want to show you kind of a short, simple one right now that might make a little bit more sense. So here in this last exercise, I have this container. Okay. And it's got a height. Just going to turn this off temporarily. So here's my container, and here's this. Let's just say for the sake of argument, I wanted this in the vertical center. It'd be really hard to do that right now. I mean, you could, you know, I could take the parent and I could do a text align. But that would actually only do the horizontal. There's no way to do, there is no text align vertical, okay? What people used to do in the past is they would use line height to try to basically fake this, you know? And that kind of worked, but what if I added an, first thing is, well, what if the height of this changed? What if it went to 400 instead of 700? Now this is, you know, it's kind of screwing with the values and I'd have to go back and change that. Or another thing that could actually happen is when you do the line height gimmick, it's per line. So if I decided later I wanted to add a second line, be a friend of the forest. See how it's like this extra space is being pushed off, and so it's not quite getting what we want. So for a long time, this was kind of a pain, but now we can do this really easily if we just turn this into either a grid or a flexbox. So I'm going to turn this into a grid. Once it's a grid, we get a main axis and a cross axis, okay? If I want my content in the horizontal center, well, that's justify content center. Note that justify center only works if something is a grid or a flex box. If I was just doing this as a normal thing, like a normal section tag, this would not work, okay? All right, so now it's in the horizontal center. I can tell this because if I resize my page, you can see how it still always stays in the center. Now I want this in the vertical center. How can I do that? Well, you do that. Align content center. So see how it places that in the horizontal. It actually, and see how it placed my other item. So it considered both items. Remember how in my last one we put all of the things in the center? It's taking all of these together. So if I were to come in here and stylize this just to kind of make it a little bigger, I don't know. There's a little space here, get rid of it. But I could set this up to these can be literally right on top of each other. Okay. And I can even add more stuff if I added another set. Let's say later I added another. No, done right now. Don't worry about what I'm doing. See how it's still in the vertical center? And if I change the height of this at a point, let's make it, I don't know, 900. It still stays in the vertical center. So this is why, you might want something like this because, you may want to just have a bunch of, you may want to have something where all of the content is in the vertical center. This is an easy way to do that. And it doesn't matter if you add or subtract things, everything will just readjust. Oh, I talked to the client. They don't want to have the donate button here. Okay, well, let's just get rid of it. And then everything redistributes. Oh, they don't want this tagline anymore. Okay, well, let's just get rid of that. And it's still just going to distribute everything to the vertical center. Okay, so this is why you might want to use, grid CSS grids, not just to sort of lay out rows and columns, but also to distribute and align stuff, which is very powerful. Okay.